In January 1980, a Canadian diplomat hid 6 American fugitives in his home in Tehran. For 79 days, he forged their documents, he studied airport security patterns, and he deceived an entire revolutionary government of the time. And when it was over, the United States hung "Thank You Canada" signs from bridges, and the U.S. Congress struck a gold medal in his name. That diplomat's name was Ken Taylor, the Canadian Caper story, a very popular story. His government was Joe Clark's minority conservative administration of the time, and the lessons that operation left behind was that of a quiet, courageous, principled action that came at genuine personal and diplomatic risk, and it became part of Canada's national mythology even till date. Now it's 2026, a new Iran war has begun, and Canada's Prime Minister issued his response from Australia while attending a trade forum after being asked about it. This is not the same country. And I want to be clear from the get-go here, because this episode is not a partisan attack on Mark Carney. It's not a defense of Iran either. And it's not a simple argument that Canada should have opposed the war or should have joined it. The question I want to ask is harder than that. And it's a question that would outlast the current conflict between the US, Iran, and Israel. The question is, does Canada actually have a foreign policy? Or have we constructed an elaborate national story, an identity about who we are in the world, the peacekeepers, the honest brokers, the defenders of the rules-based order, all of that identity and stories that collapse every single time the moment Washington applies real pressure globally? Because here's what happened in the last few weeks in precise order. On January 20, 2026, Mark Carney stood at Davos, the World Economic Forum, and delivered what was widely described as a statesman's speech. He warned of geopolitical brinkmanship. He spoke of restraint. He urged the world's most powerful governments to resist reckless escalation globally. And on February 28th, 39 days later, the United States and Israel launched a military strike on Iran without informing their allies, without UN authorization, without consulting Canada, of course. In Canada's response, Carney said, and I'm going to quote him directly here, he supports the strike, quote, with some regrets, because they represent a, quote again, failure of the international order. Now read that slowly. He called it a failure of the international order, and then he supported it. That is not a foreign policy. That's a man trying to face 2 different directions simultaneously and hoping nobody would measure his angle. Here's my thesis, stated plainly here from the get-go. Canada does not have a foreign policy. We have a mirror. We reflect back to the world whatever version of ourselves we believe the moment demand. When the world wants a peacekeeper, we are peacekeepers. When the world wants a trade partner, we are a trade partner. When Washington needs a loyal ally, we salute. When we need to reassure our citizens that we are principled, we deliver a speech at Davos. The mirror is not cynical. I don't think Canadian leaders are actually dishonest. I don't think so. But I think they're managing an impossible structural problem. A country of 40 million people sharing the world's longest border with its most powerful military and economic force. A country that has never had to truly decide who it is because the cost of deciding has always been too high for us as a nation. But the cost of not deciding is now arriving for us, and the Iran war is just the most recent invoice of such. Let's look at what Carney actually said here and what he actually did in sequence, because the contradiction itself is not just rhetorical, it's also structural and it has consequences. At Davos in January, Carney positioned Canada as a moderating force globally. He specifically warned against the kind of unilateral military action that 6 weeks later he would endorse. The speech was greeted with what one commentator called a reverent approval. When the war began, Canada was not informed nor consulted. Canadian soldiers in Kuwait were struck by Iranian missiles, and Canadians found out apparently only when satellite images were published. That detail, in my opinion, is worth thinking about carefully. Canadian soldiers were in a war zone, Canadian bunkers were damaged, and the government learned about it and told the people only after satellite images were released. Carney then said, and again I'm quoting him, "It prima facie appears the strikes are inconsistent with international law. But whether they broke international law, quote again, is a judgment for others to make." I think this is the single most telling phrase in Canada's entire response in this conflict, a judgment for others to make, not for Canada, but for others. And then within 48 hours, he said, "Canada will stand by our allies." He refused to rule out military participation. But his defense chief said Canada may be called on to help defend Gulf states. And then his defense minister said Canada would not participate. And then Carney himself finally told Parliament that Canada will never participate. 4 positions, 11 days, 1 war. Let that sink. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy, one of the most respected voices in Canadian diplomacy, described the government's response as, quote, "very confusing." This is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs being diplomatic about the fact that there is no strategy coming out of Ottawa. Now, I want to address the strongest counterargument because I think it's a real one, and Carney himself has partially talked about it. The counterargument goes like this: the rules-based order, the international order, was never neutral. It was always applied selectively by the powerful for the powerful. The US invaded Iraq without UN authorization in 2003. Canada joined that coalition of the willing diplomatically while declining to send troops. Israel has occupied Palestinian territory in violation of dozens of UN resolutions. Canada has consistently declined to apply consequences. The rules-based order, Carney himself said at Davos, was never perfectly fair. And I think that argument is intellectually honest, honestly, and I respect it. But here's the problem with it as a justification for Canada's Iran's position. I think it proves too much about our identity. If the rules-based order has always been selectively enforced and Canada is always aligned with the enforcer, then Canada's principled speeches are not principles. They're marketing. They are the brand positioning of a country that benefits enormously from an American security guarantees and American market access, and a country that performs independence while practically is dependent on another nation. Carney knows this. He said it at Davos, and then 6 weeks later, he acted exactly as every other Canadian Prime Minister before him has acted when Washington made a demand that mattered. And here's the deepest irony. Compare Canada's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 to Canada's response to the US-Israeli war right now in Iran in 2026. In both cases, a country was attacked by a more powerful neighbor without UN authorization in violation of international sovereignty norms, but Canada condemned Russia with maximum force, and Canada supported the United States with maximum ambiguity. The variable that explains the difference is not international law or politics. The variable is Washington. There's a dimension of this crisis that has received almost no serious analysis in Canadian media, in my opinion, and it's frankly the most morally urgent one. Canada is home to 280,000 Iranian-Canadians. It's one of the largest Iranian diaspora communities around the world. It's concentrated in Toronto and in Vancouver, highly educated, deeply engaged, politically set up people, and internally divided. Some of the 280,000 people fled the Islamic Republic. They've spent their entire adult lives hoping its end someday, and at a great personal cost to many of them. For them, a war that might collapse the regime is not a tragedy. It's an answer to a 40-year prayer. Others have families in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Shiraz, and they're watching airstrikes hit their home cities while their government in Ottawa supports the operation with regret. Canada has no embassy in Iran, with severe diplomatic relations. In 2012, consular services run through Ankara now. The Foreign Affairs Minister confirmed that over 2,000 Canadians in the region have requested evacuation assistance. 2,000 people. And the infrastructure to help them is a phone line to Turkey. This is not a rhetorical point, it's a governance of failure. Because when Canada endorses a war, even ambiguously, even with regrets, it assumes a set of obligations to its own citizens that it demonstrably cannot meet. We have the posture of a country that has a Middle East policy, but we do not have the infrastructure of one. The Canadian caper, the story I told you earlier, worked because Canada had an embassy in Tehran, a diplomat with a courage to act, and a government that was willing to take a genuine risk. That was the reason the Canadian caper worked. In 2026, we have none of those things. We have a statement out of Australia only when our Prime Minister is asked about it. And there's one more dimension that has been raised quietly by former military officials that deserve to be said clearly on this show, albeit I'll say it carefully. Canada's Department of National Defense has denied that Canadian forces participated in the initial strikes on Iran. And Carney has said this himself, that Canada was not informed and was not asked. But retired Major General Dennis Thompson has publicly stated that Canadian officers embedded in the Combined Airspace Operations Center, which is where the U.S. air target decisions are coordinated, would have been, in his words, directly involved in targeting. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axwood put it like this: you cannot embed Canadian officers in U.S. war fighting headquarters and then claim you had nothing to do with the war they were fighting. I don't know whether Canadian officers contributed to the target of Iran. That's not what I'm talking about. And I don't think anyone outside a classified briefing room knows anything about that. But the question itself reveals the fundamental incoherence of Canada's position. We are so deeply integrated into American military infrastructure that the line between participation and non-participation is genuinely unclear, even to the government making the claims. A country with a genuine foreign policy would have thought about all these kind of problems even before the war started. The strongest counter-argument to everything I've said so far is this: what exactly was Canada supposed to do? And I thought about this carefully. The Islamic Republic of Iran has murdered Canadian civilians. It shut down Ukraine's international airline in 2020 and killed 85 Canadians. Iran's terrorist proxy around the world. It has pursued nuclear weapons for 2 decades in defiance of every diplomatic framework. The argument that Canada should have opposed the war requires answering the question of what alternative Canada was offering. And the honest answer to that is that there was no credible alternative that Canada offered. And I take that seriously because the Iranian regime is genuinely a dangerous one, and a Canada that simply issues press releases while hiding behind procedural objections to international law, while doing nothing exactly to actually prevent Iran's nuclear capability, the same Canada would also be a failure of foreign policy. Because being passive in this process, dressed as principle, is in itself a form of dishonesty and weakness. But this is the critical distinction. Preventing Iranian nuclear capability was correct, and endorsing the specific military operation conducted without consultation, without international authorization, and without a plan for what comes after. Canada could have said, "We share the objective, but we do not endorse the method. We will not be used to legitimize a process that bypasses the institutions we depend on to constrain more powerful actors than ourselves." I think that could have been Canada's position. Spain said something like this. The Spanish Prime Minister argued that the strikes undermine international norms, and Spain is a NATO ally as well, a Western democracy, a country with at least as much exposure to American pressure as Canada. Canada chose not to take that position. That was a choice by our government, and choices have consequences, and they have, in this case, architectures that reveal what a country actually believes when the stakes are real. So where does all of this lead us as a nation? What are the consequences of a Canada that has confirmed yet again that its sense of foreign policy independence is a performance? The first consequence, in my opinion, is strategic. Canada has now signaled to Washington that there is no cost for bypassing allied consultation. Trump did not ask. Canada complained, waited 11 days, and then said, "We will never participate," only after having declined to clearly oppose the war in the first place. The lesson learned in Washington is that Canada can be moved with mild pressure and enough time. The second consequence is reputational, and this one is harder to recover from, in my opinion. Carney spent 3 months building Canada's identity as a principled middle power and the adult in the room of reckless hegemons. That positioning was real diplomatic capital. It attracted goodwill, especially from the global south and even from European partners, from countries navigating their own relationship with American dominance. That capital has now been spent, and it was spent not to advance a Canadian interest, but to manage a domestic political situation and keep the alliance relationship sort of intact. The third consequence is this, the one that I think will be felt for the longest time, especially, and is domestic consequence. Canada has over 280,000 Iranian-Canadians who now know with certainty that when their community's interest conflicts with that of American foreign policy priorities, their government will sell out and will choose the alliance with America instead. That is a community that will remember this for a very long time. That memory shapes political trust, civic engagement, and long-term social fabric of the nation that depends especially on immigration for its future. I want to be clear here. I'm not saying Canada was wrong to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying Canada was wrong to pretend it had a choice when it had already structured its military, diplomatic, and economic architecture in a way that made independent choices literally impossible. This is not a failure of this government. It's a failure that accumulated across decades by governments of every stripe and every political party who found it more convenient to borrow American security than to build a Canadian sovereignty. Let me wrap up like this. In 1980, a Canadian diplomat named Ken Taylor hid 6 American fugitives in his living room for 79 days, forged their identities, and walked them through a revolutionary checkpoint on fake Canadian passports. He did that because it was right. He did it without asking for credit, without asking for recognition, and when it was all over, the United States called him a hero. In 2026, a Canadian Prime Minister was asked for Canada's position on a war that already started, a war in which Canadian soldiers had already been in the blast radius, and he said he supported it with regret. From a podium in Sydney, Australia, The gap between Taylor in Tehran and Carney in Canberra is not just a gap between two moments. It's a gap between a country that knew what it stood for back then and a country that has spent the last 40 years carefully avoiding that question. What does Canada stand for on a global stage? Canada is not broken, and I talked about this in the previous monologue that didn't sit well with many people, but it is in a very specific and important sense an unformed nation. We have the institutions of a sovereign nation. We have the rhetoric of an independent foreign policy. We have the self-image of an honest broker. What we have never built, and what this war makes undeniable, is the architecture of a country that is willing to bear the cost of its own convictions. And I think that's very important. This is the conversation that Canada is not having right now. I've carefully observed on mainstream media, I haven't heard conversations like this. And it's the kind of conversations exactly that I love to have on this channel. If you're new to the channel, my name is Afolari. This is the Revaluate podcast, where we value structural analysis, not partisan loyalty, just the arguments and the evidences, not partisan talking points. And if this episode gave you something that you could genuinely think about, I want you to share with someone who might disagree with you. And I'm super curious what you think about this dialogue. Let's chat in the comment section. I respond to every comment, and I'll see you in the next video. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.